Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, Episode 30, your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. President Biden bows out of the 2024 presidential election and is called an honorable man by many in the pundit class. We will examine. We've all had rough weeks at work. I don't know if any of us have had as rough a week at work as Kimberly Cheatle did, the former director of the Secret Service. That has to be examined as well. So now it's Kamala. It's back to a 50-50 race. And inside the NBA on TNT is going the way of the Dodo. It's got one more season left. This is an iconic television show and is not just going to hurt Turner Sports. This loss is going to hurt the NBA brand itself. Thank you all for listening. If you're new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star. Please write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. Please consider supporting.
Act 1. Biden drops out of the presidential race, and that is the direct result of the will of the donor class.
I was a bit surprised about the level the mainstream media has bought into this narrative from the Biden administration, the White House, about what an honorable act it is that Joe Biden stepped away from running for a second term as president of the United States, that it takes such a big man, someone who's willing to put the country first, someone that is less interested in his own legacy and more interested in the sanctity of democracy, because that's what's at stake in this election, the sanctity of democracy. The mainstream media shapes the narrative of the conversation around political events such as this, a president of the United States pulling out of a race as late in the race as this one did, not running for a second term. This is a monumental, a historically noteworthy event. So the way this is being framed by the legacy media, the mainstream media, it's important not just for how people interpret this event today, but how it's interpreted in weeks, months, but namely years to come. And in this segment, I want to comment on the fact that nothing could be further from the truth, that Joe Biden made the choices that he made in order to preserve the sanctity of democracy, and that he's putting the country first above his own personal selfish desires. There are three main points that I'd like to make. One, there was no real Democratic primary. The Democratic National Committee rigged their own primary process to ensure that Joe Biden would come out the winner, because if there was any serious challenge to him, he would crumble. Two, everyone in the Democratic Party was willing to lie to themselves, to lie to the American people, because given the level of cognitive decline that we saw in Joe Biden in public, there's no way in hell that in these private meetings where Joe Biden is allegedly as sharp as he had been over the course of his 50 years in Washington, D.C., today, in the present day, there's no way that all of these people didn't notice that something was going on. Man, does this mirror 1968, where you had an entire government lying to the American people about what was going on in Vietnam. And here you have an entire political administration, you had an entire political party lying to the American people about what's going on with the cognitive decline of their president. And why was this lie so important? Frankly, I think a number of these people were instrumental in running the country. They didn't care that Joe Biden had no wherewithal whatsoever about what was going on, particularly domestically, what was going on in this country, in the United States. It was to their political and economic benefit that Joe Biden not really know what's going on. And as I will comment on in another segment in this very podcast, that was more evident than I think anyone imagined it could be, given the assassination attempt on Donald Trump and the literal fence post that they put up in front of Congress, inappropriately named Director of the Secret Service. If Biden had his wits about him, that woman would have been fired and would have been unceremoniously fired, but given the opportunity to resign. And she would have taken the opportunity to resign instead of being unceremoniously fired. That she was able to flap in the wind for as long as she did and put out those stupid ass rationales and excuses, that is illustrative of the fact that there's no one at the head of the ship that we call the Biden administration. And finally, the third point, that this has nothing to do with Joe Biden or the Democratic National Committee. This was the donors, and those donors used their proxies, Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi, to put pressure on Joe Biden to step down. And how did they do that? The easiest way to do it. They stopped donating money. They said, we're no longer willing to give you the money. And when they told Obama that, when they told Pelosi that, it was Obama and Pelosi that went back to Biden and said, we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. When the money dries up, there are no political allies. There are no political friends. So let's start with point number one, the first thing that I wanted to comment on. The fact that the Democratic primary was completely rigged so that A, no one named Kennedy could compete in it, and B, none of the presidential hopefuls in 2028 would dare step out of the Biden shadow and put their name into the ring, put their name into the fishbowl, so to speak. All of the Democratic tastemakers knew that Joe Biden could not withstand any serious primary contender. Is it not paradoxical that the party that keeps trying to indoctrinate the American people with the fact that if Donald Trump is elected, then democracy's over, it's all over with, isn't it paradoxical that it's that very party that routinely subverts its own democratic process if it has a presidential contender, a hopeful, that the tastemakers don't want? I see you, Bernie Sanders. They will just out and out rig the primary. Donald Trump, for anything that you want to say about the Republican Party, anything negative, and I'm sure that there are plenty of things that we could go on and on about for hours on end. Donald Trump won the Republican presidential primary in 2016. That very fact alone shows that there's less fuckery in the Republican National Convention, the way the Republicans run their presidential nominating process, than the Democrats. The Democrats, the party of the people, the party of the common man, have no qualms whatsoever about injecting all the fuckery you could ever want to reach a foregone conclusion. One of those foregone conclusions was Hillary Clinton, and one of those foregone conclusions was Joseph Biden. And neither one of them was going to win. No one really believed that Joe Biden was the best candidate. Even though he was a sitting incumbent president, no one really believed that that man was the best candidate to win in 2024, given his cognitive decline. And yet, the Democratic Party was willing to rig the primary in order to put him in that position, a position to run for president of the United States again. Now, is that the action, or are those the actions of a bunch of selfless people who are putting the country first? Are those the actions of a selfless man who is allowing that to happen, or more likely orchestrating that to happen? No, that's the action of a selfish man, one that is not going to give up power under any circumstances, one that is not going to put his country first, but is going to put his own self-interest first. So I don't believe for a second that Joe Biden has put the country first. Rather, this is all a bunch of PR to preserve his legacy such that it's not well understood for future generations how badly the Democratic primary process had been manipulated so that Joe Biden could be the nominee for president in 2024. And that brings me to my second point. Everyone knew that this man could not withstand a primary challenger because he could barely string together 3 sentences, and everyone was complicit on the Democratic side. You've got people in a White House administration, you've got congressional members, you've got countless bureaucrats, and you have people in state Democratic committees. You have governors of states, You've got legislators from states. They all had interactions with this man over the course of the last 12 to 18 months, and they all knew this guy isn't going to make it to the election. If he's able to string together enough complete sentences to win president of the United States, there's no way in hell he's going to be able to run this country for the next 4 years. They all knew it. Do you want me to tell you how they all knew it, dear listener? Look at the enthusiasm that has soared through the Democratic Party since Joe Biden announced that he wasn't going to run in 2024, that he was going to cede his place to Kamala Harris. You've had hundreds of millions of dollars. You've had all sorts of different groups that had been equivocal about supporting the Democratic Party nominee now enthusiastically getting involved in this primary process and on to the election in November. The lack of enthusiasm on the Democratic side was a testament to the fact that everyone knew this guy can't do it. This is all a sham. The emperor has no clothes, and in fact, it's his entourage that is pushing this false narrative. And as much as that entourage is trying to preserve their own political and economic futures, they have to, because they're tied to him, they have to push a false narrative about why Joe Biden stepped out of the race. They have to try to rehabilitate his image because they've been lying to the American people for the last 12 to 18 months. Now the third point. And this is the most important. Nancy Pelosi doesn't sit where she sits for any other reason than she is a phenomenal fundraiser. And regardless of what you think of Barack Obama and whether or not he's an astute politician, one of the things that he does astutely is raise money. And he is a darling of the donor class in the Democratic Party. So when you have someone like Barack Obama and you have someone like Nancy Pelosi on these calls with billionaires, and these billionaires are saying, I'm not donating any more money. It's over. These people, these luminaries in the Democratic Party, Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, they're not just concerned about the presidency. They realize how many seats are at stake on the Democratic side. You could be looking at losing the Senate. You could be looking at a stronger Republican majority in the House of Representatives. You could look at a number of governorships across the nation going red, going to Republicans. And they realize if these people are cutting off the Democratic Party because the head of the Democratic Party can't turn to the left or the right without looking like a robot, well, then things need to change. The line for me, and I believe it's true, that will be the legacy of this entire Keystone Cops routine will be Nancy Pelosi telling Joe Biden, if not directly, but through his surrogates, through his proxies, we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. The donor class was done. The money had dried up. George Clooney and his ilk were finished with Joe Biden. And when they saw those numbers over the course of the 2 to 3 weeks after the debate, how little major donor money was coming in, Pelosi knew well enough, Obama knew well enough, we're going to lose. And we're not just going to lose the presidency. We may very well lose the Senate, and we're going to lose a number of legislatures around the country, and this can't stand. So someone as powerful as the President of the United States was confronted with, listen, the donors, the people that really matter, have turned against you, and you're either going to step aside or you're going to get fucking steamrolled. Biden may not be able to understand much in his current mental capacity, but the one thing that any politician knows is when the money is turned against you, it's time to get out. This is one of the few moments that I can embrace social media because you have this legacy media narrative that's trying to be pushed down our throats, and yet you have what I believe is a more authentic, a more accurate narrative that is running through all of these different social media circles about what's really going on. And as a commentary on the donors had to be okay with Joe Biden and his team rigging the primary process. The donors had to be okay with Joe Biden and his team and practically everyone in the Democratic Party lying to the American people. Biden to them may have been a useful foil in that even if he is an invalid, by the time he takes office in late January for his second term, he's a useful idiot. He's their invalid. Once they realize that not only is he an invalid, he's an invalid that can't string together enough cogent thoughts to not only win the presidency, but to maintain the status of the Democratic Party. I mean, the man was pulling down Democratic contenders from Congress, senators, legislators, all the way down to your comptroller in a state like Pennsylvania. Anyone that had a D next to their name was going to suffer with Joe Biden on the ticket. I hope it is well understood in 5 years, in 10 years, in 25 years, that these politicians are beholden to their donors. And that's not you and me, dear listener. Not that I know of. I don't know any one of you that's got $1 billion and is willing to take a significant portion of that fortune and invest it in a political candidate. That to rise to these offices, you have to basically be a narcissist, and that we haven't seen any generous or any noble or any dignified action taken over the course of the last 10 days with regard to Joe Biden. I really wanted to get hashtag vote against the incumbent going, but there is one way that you can have a bloodless coup in this country, and it's the way that we've been having bloodless coups in this country for the last 100 years, and that's to piss off the donor class. Once you go south with the donor class, you're done.
Act 2, A Disastrous 10 Days for Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheatle.
Okay, so let's talk about Kimberly Cheatle, the Secret Service Director who resigned on Tuesday of this week after intense scrutiny from both Republicans and Democrats after testifying at a House Oversight Committee meeting where she, how do I say this tactfully, represented the Biden administration thoroughly and accurately, in that she couldn't string together 3 cogent sentences and had asinine excuses for the few questions that she was willing to answer. Many of the most simple questions the woman was incapable of answering or refused to answer. This is the director of the Secret Service, entrusted with guarding not only the President of the United States, but many of the political luminaries in the Senate, in the House, the Supreme Court, and she couldn't answer a simple question as to how many shots this shooter got off at former President Trump during his rally. Another of my favorite moments was when Ro Khanna, the congressman from California, asked her about the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan and the fact that the director of the Secret Service immediately resigned after that assassination attempt. And this woman was so inept that when he asked her, do you know what the Secret Service director at that time did after the assassination attempt? Her answer in a congressional oversight committee was he stayed in his job. Have we become so tribal that we could be immune to this kind of buffoonery if the buffoon is on quote unquote our team? Not only would resigning be the smart thing to do in the wake of such a disastrous demonstration of your capacity, your capability, but you figure that it would deflect some of the scrutiny that would befall the organization, the Secret Service, in the wake of the investigation. And you figure that this woman would somehow be able to salvage some kind of career opportunity in light of her resignation. Basically saying, look, it clearly can't be all my fault, but I'm going to go down. I'm the captain of the ship. I'm going to go down with the ship. And recognizing as much, some of the power brokers in the Democratic Party and in Washington, D.C. would take note, and there'd be something. There wouldn't be a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow, but there'd be something for her to fall back on once she was done. In light of the way that she handled this situation and the political ineptness, the answers that she gave to some of the most rudimentary questions, that a Secret Service agent wouldn't be on the roof of such a building because, given the roof sloping, it would be dangerous, when part of an agent's job is to become a human bullet shield in the event that someone tries to assassinate the protectee, the person that they're guarding. And it shows a very disturbing lack of political awareness on the part of the Biden administration, the fact that it's clear that President Biden himself is completely disengaged from anything going on domestically, and his political handlers being so overwhelmed with what's going on in the presidential race, and in light of some of the foreign affairs that are clearly consuming Biden's attention, this got completely overlooked. This is an assassination attempt on a presidential hopeful, and it was completely overlooked by the Biden administration, and the bureaucrats were left to basically sort out the mess themselves. It's interesting to me whether or not, if Biden had not gotten COVID, would he still persist in this presidential race, and would this be the barometer or the litmus test, the canary in the coal mine, as to how he would be able, I'll say it a third time, that he would be able to govern in his current mental state. Say what you will about Joe Biden. The man's been in Washington, D.C. for 50 years. He is a political creature. To have a Secret Service director stay on in their role, spouting off some of the dumbest shit that you've ever heard in your life, which is a direct reflection on that presidential administration. Would Joe Biden of even 5 years ago allow for such a person to persist in their job for 10 days and to go and give a disastrous performance at a judicial oversight committee? Methinks not.
Act 3. So now it's Kamala.
So now Kamala Harris is going to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States, and I'm not going to do a long segment on this. It's a coin flip, folks. It's back to 50-50. The Republicans are going to have immigration and the economy to harp on, and the Democrats are going to have abortion to harp on. Donald Trump would be well served not to say word one about mail-in ballots. It's going to be a coin flip in a number of swing states. Each one of the candidates is going to need every vote they can get.
Act 4, Inside the NBA on TNT, is a loss to the NBA brand, not just Turner Sports.
If you are unawares, the NBA, the National Basketball Association, made an obscene deal with some of the streaming services for their broadcast rights over the course of the next 11 years. And in my personal opinion, I believe that that deal is the last of the type of deals that you're going to see in professional sports. None of these sports leagues over the course of the next 10 years is going to warrant the kind of viewership that warrants the kind of money that these streaming services and these networks are going to be willing to pay today. Years ago, NBC had the television broadcast rights to the National Football League, and Fox, being a new network, so badly wanted to legitimize their platform that they paid an obscene amount at that time, and I believe this was a good, 25, 30 years ago. They paid this obscene amount of money to the NFL for those broadcast rights, and NBC was just like, we don't make any money off of those broadcast rights anyway. We're practically breaking even, and now we're going to go deep into the red. The problem was that it really hurt NBC's visibility in front of so many different people because those broadcast rights aren't about making money. It's almost akin to the cities that have these professional sports franchises. No matter what any economist tells you, a lot of these sports franchises in these cities, they lose money. The city actually loses money on the franchise. The owners make money. A lot of the vendors make money. There's a number of different people in the orbit of that team in the city that make money, but the city itself loses its ass. Why have any of these professional sports franchises then? Well, if you're a city, it does promote a sense of community within that city to have one of these sports franchises. It is free marketing for the city. It increases the city's national and now international profile to have one of these franchises. And frankly, in the calculation between the city itself and its citizenry, if you have a bunch of vendors associated with the actual professional sports franchise, but you also have businesses in the orbit of the franchise, namely bars and restaurants, namely distributors of merchandise, it is good for the overall economy of the city to have a professional sports franchise. Is it good enough that it offsets the losses? That's the debate. But the losses exist. Don't ever let yourself be deceived that the losses don't exist. And that's the exact same situation for these networks that are paying $2 or $3 or $4 billion a year for the broadcasting rights to these professional sports franchises. Are they making their money back in ad revenue? No, they're not. They're just not making enough money. That's why you see so many ads shoved into the broadcasts, because they're trying as much as they can to scrape every single penny out of every single minute of the broadcast, because they're losing their ass in the amount of money that they're paying just to have those broadcast rights. But what does it do? It increases the overall profile of that network. Amazon streaming services wants to increase their overall network profile. What do? They go out and they pay for the licensing. They pay for the broadcasting rights to professional sports games. Yes, they may lose money on the actual broadcast, but they get to shove all of their other terrible programming down your throat during the commercial breaks, and it may attract new users to ancillary Amazon services or Amazon products. No one wants to be out in the wilderness when it comes to professional sports broadcasting, because your network is long gone and forgotten. NBC found out the hard way that it's difficult to attract viewers to its other programming options if you don't have eyes on the network on Sundays or on Monday nights. The casualty in the current bidding war for the NBA television rights is Inside the NBA on TNT, the best sports show on television. I'm not a huge NBA fan. I like to watch the NBA more in the playoffs. I think the regular season, just like the NHL, there's too many games. And those too many games are often too condensed. So you have teams playing too many games in too few days, and the product suffers. You can see it on your television screen. Teams are exhausted from the East Coast having to go to the West Coast and play 5 or 6 games in a week. One thing that can draw me in to whatever's going on in the NBA 40 or 50 or 60 games into the season is the Inside the NBA broadcast on TNT. Charles, Kenny, Shaq, Ernie. This is a dream team sports show. There's no media pundit on that dais. They don't have writers from some organization commenting on the sport. It's 3 people that played the game at a very high level and somebody who's been covering the game as a commentator, doing the play-by-play for decades. There's a legitimacy and an authority to Charles and Kenny and Shaq when they speak to anything that's going on within the NBA. When there is tension, when there is bombast on the dais of the Inside the NBA broadcast, it is because they are passionate. Shaq is passionate. Kenny is passionate. Charles is passionate about the game and about their opinions, their role in the game, the way they see the game, the way it translates. A viewer can see that. It's apparent. A layperson can see that. It's apparent. Someone that's not that interested in basketball in general. That was part of the magic of the show. All these other NBA shows, they usually have a media member as part of their staff who doesn't have the same kind of gravitas as a former professional athlete, as someone that competed in the sport at a high level, and someone that won championships. And so instead of having this bombast that's backed up with the authority of having been part of the league and playing in the league at a high level, you just have bloviating. You have people that, by way of their experience covering the sport, feel like they can make the same types of claims and proclamations as someone who won 4 championships. People who are not that interested in sports, people that are not that interested in the NBA, watched that show. They tuned in to Inside the NBA to see Charles and Kenny and Shaq. The show became a cultural phenomenon. It spoke to something outside of just basketball. And now that that Turner does not have the NBA rights, I see a lot of people commenting on, well, what's TNT going to do? What's Turner going to do? What are they going to show on that network that's going to attract eyes? They don't have the Conan O'Brien show anymore. Are they going to go back to just showing old movies and hoping that that's going to carry the day? And I'm not as much concerned with what's going to happen to TNT or to Turner Sports as I am how this show and its absence from the NBA landscape is going to hurt the overall NBA brand. I'm not going to tune in to an Amazon streamed game and then stay after to see what the commentary is on that game from three people that I don't have any real affinity for, namely people who are media pundits. Charles and Shaq and Kenny, they were the bellwether for the brand. During the playoffs, they did pregame shows at different playoff sites. They did postgame shows in the arenas. This was the marquee program for the NBA brand. Am I going to pay as close attention to the NBA absent inside the NBA on TNT? Hell no. Like most of us, because I have no real affinity for any of these post-game shows or these pre-game shows, I'm going to be doing what? I'm going to be looking at it on my phone. And I'm not even going to be looking at the highlights. Very likely, I'm just going to be looking at the score on my phone. I'm not sure what I would have done if I were Adam Silver, if I could garner the type of money that he did in these deals. Would I be able to reject it? I don't know. But I believe that this deal and these types of deals that you've seen in the NFL, now in the NBA, these are going to hurt the brand over the long run because people aren't paying attention the same way that they were, and you have to cram more and more commercials into your broadcast in order to try to make up for some of the losses if you are these broadcasting partners, and it hurts the overall product, and that's going to decrease viewership. And if you take away from the NBA something that was unique to that league, a sports show that transcended the game, in 10 years, you may have bought your way into irrelevance. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.